Dear listeners, welcome to the Cozy Mystery Parlor. It's a quiet pleasure knowing you're spending these moments here with me. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? And was your day a gentle one or a busy one? Leave a small note in the comments and remember to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Child Who Did Not Arrive. In Roseford, children walked home alone. It was considered safe. It was considered sensible. And above all, it was considered normal. Mrs. Elowyn Hartley had heard this said many times over the years, usually by people who needed to believe it. That morning began as all others did. The school bell rang. Children spilled out through the gates. Parents waved briefly, then returned to kitchens and shops and the small obligations that stitched the village together. Among them was Oliver Finch. He left the schoolyard at exactly 3:30, his bag properly fastened, his jumper buttoned one button too high. He did not run. He did not linger. He walked with the careful purpose of a child who liked rules because they made the world predictable. Mrs. Elowyn Hartley noticed him because she noticed patterns. She was standing near the green, exchanging pleasantries she had exchanged 100 times before, when she saw Oliver pass the stone wall at the edge of the path. He glanced up briefly, no fear, no hurry, then continued on. That was the last time anyone saw him arrive anywhere. At 4:10, Mrs. Finch checked the clock. At 4:15, she looked out of the window. At 4:20, she told herself not to be foolish. At 4:30, she stepped onto the lane. By 5 o'clock, Roseford began to adjust its voice. "He's probably playing," someone said kindly. "Children forget the time," said another. "He'll turn up," came the reassuring chorus. The village did not say this to be cruel. It said it to be finished. Mrs. Elowyn Hartley arrived at the Finch house just as the light began to fade. The door was open. Inside, Mrs. Finch stood motionless in the hallway, coat still on, keys clenched in her hand, as though she had forgotten how to put them down. "He's never late," she said, before Elowyn could speak. The sentence was not an accusation. It was a fact. Elowyn stepped inside. Oliver's shoes were by the door, exactly where they should have been had he come home. His bag was not there. His coat was not there. "He walks straight home," Mrs. Finch said again, quieter now. "Always the same way." Elowyn nodded. "Has he ever taken another route?" she asked. Mrs. Finch shook her head. "He doesn't like shortcuts." That settled something. Elowyn stepped back outside and looked down the lane toward the path Oliver took each day, past the green, along the hedgerow, across the footbridge, and up toward the cottages beyond. It was an ordinary path. That was what made it dangerous. By the time the constables arrived, dusk had already softened the edges of the village. They asked their questions gently. They wrote a few notes. They promised to look. Their voices carried the confidence of men who believed this sort of thing usually resolved itself. Elowyn did not share that belief. As she walked home later, she paused near the stone wall where Oliver had passed earlier that afternoon. She stood there longer than necessary. There was nothing to see. And yet, something had already gone wrong. Not with the child, with the certainty that had once surrounded him. When Elowyn reached her door, the school bell rang once in the distance, thin, distant, and already finished. She turned back toward the path. Somewhere along it, she knew, the village would soon begin to explain what it preferred to believe, and by morning those explanations would sound very much like truth. In Roseford, once something sounded like truth, it became impolite to question it. Chapter 2. The Comfort of Simple Explanations. By midday, Roseford had decided what it believed. Not loudly, not together, and not quite consciously. It happened the way these things always did, over kitchen sinks, behind lace curtains, between nods exchanged at the post office. Children wander. Boys get distracted. Someone will have seen him. Mrs. Elowyn Hartley heard these phrases repeated with small variations, like hymns sung from memory rather than conviction. She stood at the edge of the village green, watching two constables walk away from the Finch house. Their pace was unhurried, their notebooks already half closed. The house itself looked as though it were holding its breath. Oliver Finch's school shoes sat by the door, neatly placed heel to heel. His mother had done that without thinking. Habit asserted itself when fear needed something to cling to. Inside, Mrs. Finch sat rigidly on the sofa, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. "They said he probably took the long way," she murmured, staring just above the fireplace, "or went to the stream. He liked the stream." Elowyn sat beside her, close enough to feel the faint tremor running through her arms. "Did Oliver ever stay out without telling you?" she asked gently. Mrs. Finch shook her head at once. "Never, not once. He always came straight home." Her voice broke on the last word. Elowyn nodded, filing the certainty away. Children were creatures of habit until something interfered with the pattern. Outside, the school bell rang. Once, then stopped. Elowyn noticed. That bell rang twice every day, once for lunch dismissal, once to call the children back. Today, there was only one ring. The village carried on regardless. Elowyn stepped outside. From the lane, she could see the path Oliver took each morning, past the green, along the hedgerow, across the footbridge, and toward the cottages beyond. It was not a dangerous route, which made it worse. She walked it slowly, letting the ground speak. The gravel was undisturbed, the hedge showed no broken branches, the footbridge creaked obligingly beneath her weight. Halfway along, she saw it, a school timetable, folded once, placed carefully on the stone wall beside the path. Not dropped, not crumpled, placed. Elowyn picked it up. The paper was dry, unmarked, no dirt on the edges, no sign it had been carried far or handled roughly. In the damp air, there should have been a smudge of fingerprints. There were none. Something tightened in her chest, the familiar sensation that came when a simple explanation quietly failed. A voice sounded behind her. "Oh, good, you found it." She turned. Mr. Collins, the village clerk, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression carried relief, almost satisfaction. "We thought he might have lost it," he said. "Children do that. Gets windy here." Elowyn met his eyes. "Does it?" Mr. Collins smiled faintly. "Well, it can." She held up the paper. "There's no wind damage." He shrugged. "Still, no harm done." It was the sort of sentence people used when they wanted a story to end. Elowyn looked past him toward the far end of the path. "Who walks this route besides Oliver?" she asked. Mr. Collins hesitated. "Oh, people. Dog walkers, mothers, the postman, anyone, really." Elowyn nodded. Anyone who might speak to a child. His smile thinned. "I don't see what you're suggesting." "Neither do I. Yet." That afternoon, the search widened. Not dramatically, no sirens, no shouting, but politely. Men walked the hedgerows, women called Oliver's name with voices carefully kept steady. By evening, the calls softened. By nightfall, they stopped altogether. At the Finch house, a light burned in Oliver's room. His bed was turned down. His favorite book lay open at the place he had last marked. Elowen stood in the doorway, feeling something cold settle behind her ribs. The village had begun to wait. Waiting was dangerous, because waiting assumed the child would return, and the people who waited longest were often the ones who had already decided he wouldn't. As Elowen stepped back into the lane, she looked once more toward the path, toward the place where the timetable had been left like a quiet message. Someone had wanted Oliver to stop there. Someone had wanted him to listen, and whatever that something was, it had not been meant for a child. Chapter 3. What the Path Remembered. By the third morning, Roseford had grown quiet in a different way. The searching had not stopped, but it had lost its urgency. People walked the lanes because it was expected of them, not because they believed they would find anything new. Voices called Oliver Finch's name with the careful politeness reserved for public grief. No one shouted. Shouting suggested hope. Mrs. Elowen Hartley walked alone. She had chosen the path again, not because she expected it to reveal something new, but because paths remembered things that people forgot. The hedgerow stood unchanged. The footbridge creaked. The stone wall where the timetable had rested now held nothing but damp moss and the faint outline where paper had briefly pressed against stone. Elowen paused there. Children did not leave things carefully unless asked to. She imagined Oliver standing at that spot, small hands folding the paper just so, waiting, listening. She moved on. At the bend where the path narrowed, she noticed something she had not seen before. A scuff mark. Not deep, not violent, just the faint drag of a shoe where someone had turned suddenly, or been turned. Elowen crouched, studying it. The mark faced back toward the village, not away. That mattered. A soft cough sounded behind her. Mrs. Bramwell stood a few paces back, wrapped in a cardigan much too heavy for the season. "I thought you might come this way again," the woman said. Elowen rose slowly. "Did you?" Mrs. Bramwell nodded. "I walk here every morning, or I did." Elowen waited. "I saw Oliver that day," Mrs. Bramwell said. Elowen's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. "When?" "Just after the school bell," Mrs. Bramwell replied. "He was walking as usual, bag on his back, head down." "And?" Elowen prompted. Mrs. Bramwell hesitated. "He wasn't alone." The words settled between them like mist. Elowen said quietly, "Who was with him?" Mrs. Bramwell shook her head. "I didn't see properly, only someone walking beside him, taller, an adult." Elowen felt her pulse steady into focus. "Did they speak to him?" "Yes." "Did Oliver stop?" "Yes." "Did he seem afraid?" Mrs. Bramwell's mouth trembled. "No, that's the thing. He looked attentive, like a child being spoken to by someone important." Elowen nodded once. "Did anyone tell anyone?" she asked. Mrs. Bramwell's eyes dropped. "At first, no. It didn't seem strange. People speak to children all the time." "And later?" "Later, I told myself it was nothing," she said, voice breaking. "You don't want to be the woman who panics or accuses." Elowen said gently, "But you are telling me now." Mrs. Bramwell nodded. "Because I remembered something else." Elowen waited. "The person didn't walk toward the cottages," Mrs. Bramwell said slowly. "They turned off, toward the old school outbuilding." Elowen felt the shift immediately. The outbuilding had been closed for years, unused classrooms, forgotten storage, doors that stuck and windows that watched the village without being watched in return. "Did anyone else see this?" Elowen asked. Mrs. Bramwell shook her head. "If they did, they haven't said so." Elowen thanked her and continued on, her steps measured, her thoughts sharp. By midday she stood before the outbuilding, its paint peeled politely, its windows stared back without curiosity, its door hung slightly ajar, though no one claimed to have opened it. Inside, dust lay thick on desks no child had touched in years, and on the floor, just inside the doorway, lay something small and familiar. A shoe. Oliver Finch's shoe, placed neatly on its side. Not lost, not torn away, placed. Elowen closed her eyes briefly. This was no longer a disappearance. This was a message. Someone wanted the village to find this, eventually, after hope had thinned, after certainty had dulled. As she stepped back into the light, the realization settled fully and coldly into place. Oliver Finch had not wandered into danger. Danger had stepped into his path, and worse still, someone in Roseford had seen it happen and decided to remember too late.
Chapter 4. The Places Adults Don't Revisit. The old school outbuilding had been locked for years. That, at least, was what Roseford told itself. Mrs. Elowen Hartley stood just outside the doorway, studying the warped wood and tired hinges, the polite way neglect tried to pass for closure. Oliver Finch's shoe lay exactly where she had found it, untouched, as though even the constables had hesitated to move it. Elowen bent and lifted it carefully. It was clean. No mud on the sole, no scuffing along the sides. It had not been dragged here by accident or violence. It had arrived by intention, either Oliver's or someone else's. Inside, the air smelled of chalk and damp paper. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating rows of desks frozen in orderly patience. This room had not been abandoned in a hurry. It had been retired. Elowen moved slowly between the desks, fingertips brushing worn wood. Children had once sat here, feet swinging, voices too loud for the village's liking. She could almost hear it, the whispers, the reprimands, the careful corrections. "Still poking about?" The voice came from behind her. Mr. Collins stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, exactly as he had been on the path. Elowen did not turn. "I thought the building was locked." "It usually is," he replied mildly. "I suppose someone forgot." Elowen turned then. Forgotten things have a habit of being remembered later. Mr. Collins smiled thinly. "You're very fond of unsettling observations." "I'm fond of accuracy," Elowen said. "Why was this building closed?" He hesitated. "Budget, falling numbers, progress." Elowen held his gaze. "That's not the order these things usually happen in." Silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable. Finally, Mr. Collins sighed. "There were complaints long ago." "About what?" Elowen asked. He shifted his weight. "Teaching methods, discipline, nothing that would interest you now." Elowen stepped closer to a desk near the back of the room. Carved faintly into the wood were initials, small, careful, repeated, as though reassurance came from writing one's own name. Children don't carve names into desks because they're bored. They do it to prove they exist. Mr. Collins stiffened. "Who taught here last?" she asked. "A Mr. Harrowby, retired, left the village years ago." "Left," Elowen repeated, "or was asked to." Mr. Collins did not answer. That afternoon, Elowen visited the parish records. They were kept in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of dust and denial. As she turned the pages, patterns emerged, small notes, half-recorded incidents, concerns dismissed as misunderstandings. One name appeared more than once. Not Oliver Finch, another child, years earlier. A girl who had stopped attending classes suddenly. Her family moved away soon after. The village remembered her as troubled, a word Roseford used when it did not wish to remember more. Elowen closed the ledger slowly. This outbuilding had not been closed because it was old. It had been closed because it was awkward. As evening fell, she walked back toward the Finch house. A lamp burned in the window. Mrs. Finch sat at the table, staring at nothing. "I keep thinking I hear him," she whispered when Elowen entered. "Every sound feels like a promise." Elowen took her hand gently. "You're not wrong to listen." Mrs. Finch looked up, eyes red but focused. "You think someone took him?" "Yes," Elowen said quietly. "And you think others knew?" Elowen did not answer at once. Outside, footsteps passed along the lane. A door closed. Somewhere laughter rose and fell, thin, brittle, uncomfortable. "I think," Elowen said at last, "that Roseford is very good at deciding what it cannot afford to know." That night, Elowen returned to the outbuilding once more. The door was closed now, locked. Someone had remembered. And that more than anything else told her she was close, because villages lock doors when they are afraid of what might still be inside.
Chapter 5. When Silence Begins to Speak. The first person to break was not who Mrs. Elowen Hartley expected. It was not a grieving parent, not a nervous official, not even someone with something obvious to lose. It was Miss Ada Wilkes. She rang Elowen's bell just after dusk, standing on the step as though she had been placed there deliberately and then left to reconsider. She was small and neatly dressed, her coat buttoned too tightly, her gloves twisted together in careful distress. "I shouldn't be here," she said at once. Elowen stepped aside. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." Miss Wilkes entered, moving as though the room itself might object to her presence. She had taught music at the school for nearly 30 years and had retired quietly, without speeches or farewell. People like Miss Wilkes tended to disappear by arrangement. "I heard you've been asking questions about the outbuilding," she said. "I have," Elowen replied, setting the kettle on. Miss Wilkes stared into her cup as if hoping the steam might reorder her thoughts. "They're saying things again." Elowen sat opposite her. "Who is they?" "The same people as always, the ones who decide when a thing becomes a problem." Elowen waited. "I taught Oliver Finch. He was observant, too observant sometimes. Children like that, they notice what adults assume is invisible." Elowen felt the familiar tightening in her chest. What did Oliver notice? Miss Wilkes swallowed. "He asked why certain rooms were never used, why certain names were never mentioned, why some rules only applied sometimes." "And?" Elowen asked gently. "I told him what I was told," she said miserably, "that it was complicated, that he'd understand when he was older." Elowen nodded. Children are often told that. Miss Wilkes's voice dropped. "The day before he disappeared, he asked me about Mr. Harrowby." Elowen's gaze sharpened. "What did you say?" "I said Mr. Harrowby no longer lived in Roseford, which was true, but not complete." Elowen leaned forward slightly. "What did Oliver say?" Miss Wilkes hesitated. "He said someone had spoken to him, someone who knew his name, someone who said he could explain why the outbuilding was closed." The room seemed to shrink. "Did Oliver say where this person wanted to meet him?" Elowen asked. Miss Wilkes nodded. "After school, near the old rooms." Elowen closed her eyes briefly. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. Miss Wilkes's shoulders sagged. "Because the last time I mentioned Harrowby's name, I was reminded of my place. I was told not to resurrect matters that had been settled." Settled. The word tasted of dust. Miss Wilkes looked up suddenly. "You don't think Oliver was—" "No," Elowen said firmly. "I think Oliver was listening." A knock came at the door, sharp, irritated. Elowen opened it to find Mr. Collins standing stiffly in the lamplight, his eyes already searching the room beyond her. "You've had visitors," he said. "Yes," Elowen replied calmly. "I have." His jaw tightened. "You're upsetting people. People who prefer comfort to clarity. This is no longer appropriate," Mr. Collins snapped. "Neither is a child disappearing." Miss Wilkes rose, trembling. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Mr. Collins turned on her. "You always do, Ada. You never know when to let things lie." Elowen stepped between them. "Enough." Mr. Collins flushed. "You have no authority here." "No," Elowen agreed, "but I have memory, and so does Roseford, whether it likes it or not." For a moment his composure fractured. "Some matters," he said quietly, "are closed for good reason." Elowen met his gaze. Closed rooms still contain what was left inside. Mr. Collins turned away without another word. That night, Elowen walked once more toward the outbuilding. This time, she did not go alone. A light flickered inside, unsteady, deliberate. Someone was there, and whoever it was, they were no longer content to let silence do the work for them.
Chapter 6. The Person Who Knew His Name. The light inside the outbuilding was faint and uneven, as though whoever held it was uncertain how long they intended to stay. Mrs. Elowen Hartley paused at the threshold. There were no hurried footsteps, no startled movement, only the patient stillness of a place that had waited years to be remembered. She pushed the door open. A single lantern burned on a desk near the back of the room, its glow stretching long shadows across the floor. Standing beside it, hands clasped tightly in front of him, was Mr. Collins. He looked smaller in the lantern light, older, less certain of his place. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said. Elowen closed the door behind her. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," he replied. "But then you've made a habit of that." She stepped closer. "Why did Oliver come here?" Mr. Collins' mouth tightened. He was curious. Children are always curious. They don't vanish because of it. He exhaled slowly. "You don't understand what you're digging into." Elowen met his gaze. "Then explain." For a moment he seemed prepared to refuse, then something in him gave way. "He recognized me," Mr. Collins said quietly, "from the records office. He used to come with his mother. He knew my name." Elowen felt the last piece settle into place. "You spoke to him on the path." Mr. Collins nodded. "I told him I could answer his questions, that some things had been misunderstood, that he shouldn't listen to gossip." "You led him here," Elowen said. "I meant to reassure him," Mr. Collins snapped. "I meant to stop this from starting again." Elowen's voice softened. "Starting again?" Mr. Collins turned away. Harrowby wasn't the only one blamed, but he was the one sacrificed. The village needed someone to carry the guilt so the rest of us could continue. "And Oliver?" Elowen asked. Mr. Collins swallowed. "Oliver overheard something in the records room about the agreements, the payments, why the outbuilding was closed." Elowen's heart thudded. "What agreements?"
Quiet ones, Mr. Collins said, resignations, settlements, the understanding that certain things would never be spoken of again. She took a steady breath, and when Oliver began asking questions, "I panicked," Mr. Collins admitted. "I thought if I explained it gently, if I framed it properly, he would forget." Elowen's voice dropped. "Children don't forget truths, they repeat them." Mr. Collins nodded miserably. "He said he was going to tell his teacher. He said it wasn't fair." Elowen closed her eyes. "And then?" she asked. His voice barely carried. "He fell." The word landed heavily between them. "He tripped on the stairs," Mr. Collins said quickly. "It was dark. I reached for him. He slipped." Elowen looked at him steadily. "And he died." "Yes." The lantern flickered. "You didn't mean to kill him, but you meant to protect the village." "I meant to protect everyone," Mr. Collins whispered. "You meant to protect yourself," Elowen replied gently. Tears streaked his face. "What was I supposed to do?" Elowen's voice was firm now. "Tell the truth." Footsteps sounded outside. Mr. Collins stiffened. "They can't know everything." "They already do. They've simply chosen not to say it aloud." The door opened. Detective Inspector Calder stepped inside, flanked by 2 officers. "Mr. Collins," Calder said quietly, "you're under arrest." As they led him past her, Mr. Collins looked back once, eyes hollow. "I only wanted it to stay buried." Elowen met his gaze. "Buried things don't stay quiet." The lantern was extinguished. Darkness reclaimed the room. But this time it felt different, as though something long trapped had finally been allowed to breathe.
Chapter 7. What the Village Chose to Remember. Roseford did not wake differently the next morning. Milk bottles still clinked against stone steps, curtains were drawn back, the bakery opened on time. If anything had happened at all, it appeared to have happened somewhere else. This was how Roseford survived difficult truths, by continuing politely around them. Mrs. Elowen Hartley stood at her window, watching Mr. Collins's house across the lane. The curtains were closed. A police car had been there during the night, discreetly, efficiently. By morning, it was gone. By mid-morning, the story had already begun to soften. "He was under a great deal of pressure," someone said at the post office. "He didn't mean for things to go so far," said another. "A tragic misunderstanding," murmured a third. Elowen heard them all. She walked to the village green, where small groups stood close together, voices lowered not in shame, but in discomfort. When they saw her, conversations faltered, not stopped, merely thinned. "You've done enough now, Mrs. Hartley," Mrs. Bramwell said carefully. "The authorities will take it from here." Elowen met her gaze. "They will take the crime." Mrs. Bramwell frowned. "Isn't that enough?" Elowen did not answer. At the school, Miss Wilkes sat alone in the music room, her fingers resting silently on the closed piano lid. "They've asked me to take leave," she said quietly when Elowen entered, "just for a little while, until things settle." Elowen's jaw tightened. "Settle for whom?" Miss Wilkes smiled faintly. "Not for Oliver." In the staff room, notices had already been rearranged. A substitute's name appeared where Oliver's class once had been. The timetable moved on. At the Finch house, grief had deepened into something heavier. Mrs. Finch sat at the table, Oliver's shoe resting between her hands as though it were made of glass. "They said it was an accident," she said. "They said he fell." Elowen sat beside her. "They said what they could live with." Mrs. Finch looked up, eyes steady now. "Do you believe it was an accident?" Elowen did not soften the truth.
I believe he was put in a position where harm became inevitable. Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. That's what it feels like. Outside, a group of parents walked past the house without stopping, not out of cruelty, but caution. Attention lingered too long, and it became dangerous. That afternoon, Detective Inspector Calder came to see Elowen. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." Elowen nodded. "That doesn't make it easier." "No," Calder agreed, "but it makes it honest." He hesitated. "There will be an inquiry. Records examined, questions asked." Elowen looked toward the green. "And after?" Calder exhaled. "After, Roseford will decide which parts it remembers." That evening, the church bells rang again, twice, as they always had. People paused to listen, reassured by the sound. Children were called in for supper. Doors were locked. Lamps were lit. Normality returned with remarkable efficiency. Elowen walked the path once more. The stone wall was bare now. The outbuilding stood locked, officially this time, its key held by the council. As she turned back toward home, she understood something fully at last. Oliver Finch had not been killed by one man alone. He had been failed by a village that believed silence was kindness. And silence, she knew, was never neutral. It chose sides.
Chapter 8. The Answer That Did Not Comfort. Final Lock. The inquest was held on a Thursday. Roseford preferred Thursdays for such things, far enough from the weekend to avoid reflection, close enough to Friday to promise relief. Mrs. Elowen Hartley sat near the back of the parish hall, hands folded in her lap, listening as words were arranged carefully into shapes that resembled truth without fully touching it. An unfortunate accident, a tragic fall, no evidence of malicious intent. The phrases landed softly, like cushions placed over sharp corners. Mr. Collins was not present. His name was spoken sparingly, as though repetition might invite complication. The focus remained on procedure rather than responsibility, on sequence rather than choice. When Mrs. Finch was called to speak, she stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only solid thing left to her. "My son," she said, her voice steady only by effort, "was curious. He asked questions. He trusted adults." No one interrupted her. "He believed that if something was wrong, someone would fix it." Her gaze moved across the room, over familiar faces, over lowered eyes. That belief cost him his life. Silence followed. Not the reverent kind, the careful kind. The verdict was delivered without ceremony. Heads nodded, pens moved, chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood, already preparing to leave. Outside, conversation resumed too quickly, as though the air itself had grown uncomfortable. Elowen found herself walking beside Detective Inspector Calder. "They won't say murder," he said quietly. Elowen nodded. "They rarely do when the answer implicates more than one person." Calder hesitated. "You could leave Roseford, you know." She smiled faintly. "And miss the consequences?" That evening, Elowen returned to the outbuilding one final time. It had been cleared now, desks removed, windows boarded. A council notice had been nailed to the door, announcing plans for demolition. Community use, it promised, broad enough to mean anything, careful enough to mean nothing. She stood there as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. Oliver Finch would be remembered, she knew, but selectively, as a tragedy, as a warning, as something sad and finished. Not as a question, not as a responsibility. As she turned away, footsteps sounded behind her.
Mrs. Bramwell stood there, arms folded tightly across her chest. "You've made things difficult," she said. Elowen met her gaze. "Truth often does." "We never meant for any of this to happen," Mrs. Bramwell insisted. "No, you meant for it not to be noticed." She flinched. That night, Elowen sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting its circle of light. She opened her notebook and wrote only one sentence before closing it again. "Silence is not the absence of harm. It is the decision to allow it." Outside, Roseford settled into sleep, comforted by routine, soothed by familiar sounds. But something had shifted beneath the hedges and lanes, and Elowen knew this with quiet certainty. The village would never again be able to claim it did not know.
Epilogue. What remained? The demolition took place on a Monday. There were no speeches, no gathering, just the arrival of machinery early in the morning, before most of Roseford had finished breakfast. Mrs. Elowen Hartley watched from a distance as the first wall of the old outbuilding came down. Dust rose and drifted across the lane, settling on hedges, shoes, and the hems of coats. No one stopped to watch for long. By afternoon, the space where the building had stood was cleared and leveled, as though it had never existed at all. A council notice announced future plans, community use, it said, a phrase broad enough to mean anything, and therefore nothing. At the school, a new timetable was issued, names shifted, lessons continued. Oliver Finch's desk was reassigned. Mrs. Finch left Roseford before the year ended. She did not announce it. Her house was sold quickly. The curtains were taken down. The garden grew wild for a season before someone trimmed it back into order. People spoke of her kindly once she was gone. That, Elowen thought, was how villages forgave themselves. Weeks later, on a quiet evening, Elowen walked the path one last time. The stone wall stood bare. The hedgerow rustled softly. The footbridge creaked, obliging as ever. At the place where the timetable had been found, she paused. Nothing marked it now. And yet she could still see it, the careful fold, the pause, the moment a child had believed answers were meant to be given. She turned toward home as the light faded. Behind her, Roseford settled into itself once more, comforted by routine, reassured by the illusion that this had been an ending. Elowen knew better. Villages did not forget. They absorbed. And somewhere in Roseford, perhaps years from now, another child would ask a question adults found inconvenient. Whether the answer would be different remained to be seen. Elowen closed her door, lit her lamp, and wrote a single line in her notebook before setting it aside. What is buried is never gone. It is only waiting. The kettle clicked off. Life went on, and Roseford slept, a little less innocently than before.
Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed with you, you're always welcome back. The Cozy Mystery Parlor will be here whenever you're ready for another quiet mystery.